Hey there, fellow history enthusiasts. If you're ready to embark on a journey through the mind-numbingly dull corridors of the Byzantine Empire's hairpin approval processes, then smash that like button and subscribe to Sleepless Historian for more riveting tales of the absurdly mundane. And hey, why not turn on loop? You'll want to hear this one multiple times, just like a Byzantine bureaucrat reviewing hairpin designs for the 7th time. Nay, see. Now, before you roll your eyes and assume that hairpins are as exciting as watching paint dry, let me assure you, this is not just a story about mere accessories. No, my friends, we are diving deep into the tangled web of Byzantine bureaucracy, where the simple act of securing a hairpin could turn into a multi-year saga of red tape, endless forms, and debates that could make even the most ardent history buff contemplate a career in accounting. Picture this. The year is 550 AD. The Byzantine Empire is at its zenith, with emperors and empresses strutting about in their finest silks. But wait, what's that? A hairpin? Yes, a hairpin has emerged on the scene, and it's not just any hairpin. It's a fashionable piece that could potentially upset the delicate balance of aristocratic fashion. Now, in a society where the shape of a hairpin could dictate social standing, you can bet your last gold coin that the approval process for this innocuous accessory was as convoluted as the Empire's own territorial disputes. Aniwao, day, Atomaokiwa. As we delve into this hair-raising history, prepare yourself for tales of clerical errors, tortuous memos, and the sheer absurdity of the Byzantine obsession with aesthetic conformity. Oh yes, the bureaucrats were hard at work, ensuring that every hairpin met the exacting standards set forth by the Imperial Fashion Council, an organization so powerful it could make or break a noble's social life with a mere flick of a quill. Oh, so grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and relax as we unravel this surprisingly intricate saga of hairpins and the bureaucratic nightmares they spawned. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single minute of this delightful drudgery. As we dive deeper into the Byzantine hairpin and approval process, it's important to acknowledge just how seamlessly mundane details can transform into riveting tales of bureaucratic hurdles. Yes, my dear viewers, we're talking about the meticulous inventory procedures that governed the production and distribution of hairpins in a time when even the finest strands of gold were subject to the whims of the Imperial Fashion Council. Nitsawa. Debo. Nai. Isidium. I so. Picture, if you will, a dimly lit warehouse somewhere in Constantinople. It's the year 1025, and a gaggle of clerks are hunched over wooden desks, quills scratching away on parchment as they document every conceivable detail about hairpins. There's a clerk named Gregorios, whose sole responsibility is to track the inventory of hairpin materials. Gregorios was a man of unparalleled dedication, or as some might say, an unfortunate soul who had no choice but to find purpose in the minutiae of life. With a ledger so thick that it could double as a doorstop, he painstakingly recorded the lengths of gold wire, the quality of gemstones, and the exact diameter of each hairpin, down to the millimeter. One might think that the hairpin approval process would simply require a quick inspection of the items, but nay, the Byzantine Empire was not one for half measures. Each hairpin had to undergo a rigorous vetting process. First, Gregorios would inspect the materials to ascertain their compliance with the Council's standards. Any hairpin not meeting the required specifications was subject to a write-up so meticulously detailed that it could rival the works of Homer. If you thought getting rejected from a job was bad, imagine receiving a bureaucratic memo stating that your hairpin was insufficiently ornate or lacking in sparkle. But it didn't stop Once a hairpin cleared Gregorio's watchful gaze, it would then be whisked away to the approval room, a place that could only be described as a bureaucratic purgatory. Here, another team of clerks, well versed in the Byzantine arts of red tape, would conduct a secondary verification. They were notorious for their insistence on proper alignment. And I don't mean the kind of alignment for a satisfying hairdo. No, they measured the angle of the pin in relation to the curvature of the decorative embellishments, ensuring that even the slightest deviation would result in a rejection that echoed through the halls of the aristocracy. Now, let's talk about material costs. The hairpin market was a veritable gold mine, or perhaps a silver mine, depending on the whim of the buyer. The cost of materials fluctuated like the tides, driven by everything from trade routes disrupted by pesky pirates to the whims of emperors who suddenly decided that gold-plated hairpins were so last season. The production of a single hairpin might require the finest gold, a smattering of colorful enamel, and a precious stone or two, leading to a production cost that could rival a small estate. The result? Hairpins became not just accessories, but status symbols that spoke volumes about one's wealth, or lack thereof. But alas, the Byzantine Empire was nothing if not complex. The procurement process for these materials was riddled with its own set of bureaucratic hoops. Artisans were required to submit applications to the Imperial Supply Office, complete with detailed plans of their hairpin designs. Picture a long line of artisans, each clutching scrolls, bursting with dramatic illustrations of their latest creations, waiting for their moment to present their case to the harried officials inside. Once submitted, these applications were subject to a waiting period that could extend for weeks. An eternity, really, in the fast-paced world of fashion. During this time, the artisans would often engage in spirited discussions about the latest gossip in the court, with debates that could turn heated over whether a particular design was too ostentatious or not ostentatious enough. After all, one slip-up could mean the difference between hosting lavish parties or being relegated to the corners of society, where one might only be seen sporting a common hairpin, the ultimate symbol of failure. The approval process itself was a spectacle to behold. Once an artisan was finally granted an audience with the Imperial Fashion Council, they would be ushered into a room filled with the most powerful figures in the empire, all of whom took their positions with the seriousness of a royal execution. The artisans would present their hairpins with the kind of flair typically reserved for grand announcements. "Behold the elegance of my creation," they would proclaim, trying to hold back the tremor in their voices. However, the council members, dressed in their finest vestments, would critique with surgical precision. "Pray tell, dear artisan, what is the rationale behind using turquoise in this design? Is it not well known that turquoise is the color of the plebeians?" One particularly discerning council member might sniff. Another could simply wave a dismissive hand and declare, "This pin lacks the grandiosity required for a lady of the court. It is a shame, for I was hoping to see something magnificent today." The rejections were swift and merciless, often resulting in artisans leaving the council chamber in tears, clutching their rejected designs as if they held the last remnants of their dignity. The sheer brutality of the process was a rite of passage, separating the wheat from the chaff in the world of Byzantine hairpin fashion. No. Once a hairpin did receive the coveted stamp of approval, it entered the distribution phase, a labyrinthine bureaucracy all its own. Hairpins were not simply handed over to the artisans. No, they were catalogued, assigned a unique identification number, and then stored under lock and key within the Imperial Fashion Repository. This repository was a magnificent structure, adorned with intricate mosaics depicting the history of hairpin fashion, and it housed a collection so vast one could easily spend days wandering its halls, marveling at the endless rows of approved hairpins. Each hairpin had to be logged into a grand ledger, where clerks like Gregorio's would once again take center stage. If you thought the initial tracking of materials was tedious, wait until you heard about the distribution codes. Each hairpin that passed the stringent approval process was assigned a distribution code that indicated its style, design, and the date of approval. This code was crucial. It ensured that no hairpin could ever be mistaken for another, which, as you can imagine, was of paramount importance in a society obsessed with status. Ha. I'll say, ni hao, and say, or, hoa. Once the codes were assigned, the approved hairpins were sent out to designated artisans who could then sell them in the marketplace. But this was not the end of the story. Oh no, because the Byzantine Empire, in all its bureaucratic glory, had a system of checks and balances that would make even the most jaded modern-day bureaucrat weep with envy. Whoa. What? Artisans were required to report back on their sales, submitting detailed records of every hairpin sold, including the names of buyers, the price paid, and even a brief description of the buyer's social standing. This led to an entire underground economy of artisans who mastered the art of deception, cleverly modifying hairpins to appear as if they were approved when they were not. Oh, they so. And thus, we find ourselves at the intersection of fashion and bureaucracy, where the Byzantine hairpin approval process became a tangled web of inventory procedures, material costs, and bureaucratic rules, all intricately designed to maintain a status quo, rooted in absurdity. A hairpin, my friends, was not just a hairpin. It was a symbol of identity, a status marker, and above all, a testament to the lengths and widths to which the Byzantine Empire would go to uphold its standards. Oh. So, the next time you see a simple hairpin, take a moment to consider the Byzantine bureaucratic machine that once turned this innocuous accessory into a matter of life, death, and social standing. For in the world of the sleepless historian, even the most tedious topics can weave a narrative as rich and tangled as the finest strands of hair. Now, let's delve deeper into the mind-numbingly intricate inventory procedures that underpinned the Byzantine hairpin approval process. Imagine, if you will, a vast warehouse, dimly lit, buzzing with the sounds of scribes scratching quills on parchment, as they painstakingly catalog every single hairpin that dared to enter the realm of the imperial court. Yes, these were not just any hairpins. They were the glittering symbols of status, each one demanding its own unique registration number, which was, of course, written in triplicate. One copy for the local market, one for the imperial records, and one for the imperial records, and one for the eternal abyss of paperwork that forever haunt the bureaucratic halls of Byzantium. The inventory clerks, who may as well have been monks in a scriptorium for all the joy they derived from their work, had the arduous task of inspecting each hairpin with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for rare manuscripts. Their eyes, sharpened by years of staring at shiny metal, would detect even the tiniest deviation from the approved design. A hairpin that was a mere millimeter off in diameter could lead to hours of debate within the chambers of the local guild. Was it a felony? A misdemeanor? Or simply the result of a rogue artisan who had miscalculated after one too many cups of watered-down wine? Let's not forget the material costs involved in this bureaucratic ballet. The Byzantine Empire, known for its opulence, had a strict hierarchy of materials that could be used for hairpins. Gold and silver were obviously at the top of the list, followed closely by bronze, which was considered the everyman's hairpin material. Then there were the legally questionable materials, like pewter, which, while not officially recognized, had a certain underground appeal. The costs of these materials varied not only based on market demand, but also on the whims of the imperial treasury, which, much like an indecisive toddler, could change its mind at any moment. Now, let's break down the math. The average gold hairpin in the 10th century could set a fashionable Byzantine lady back a whopping 50 soludi, a sum that could have bought her a decent villa, or at the very least a week's worth of goat cheese. The silver hairpins hovered around the 30 solidi mark, while a bronze alternative could be purchased for a mere 5 solidi. Near. But wait! That's before we factor in the approval fees, which, depending on the mood of the local bureaucrat, could be anywhere from 1 to 10 solidi. Yes, the same bureaucrat who spent his day cataloging hairpins and counting grains of rice was also the one who held the purse strings of fashion. And speaking of fees, let's take a moment to discuss the bureaucratic rules that govern the hairpin industry. The Byzantine rules. As tangled as the hair they were meant to adorn. Every artisan had to submit a form, the form of hairpin approval, naturally, and it had to be filled out in triplicate. This form required the artisan to enter their name, their guild affiliation, the type of hairpin they were creating, the materials used, and the estimated price. There was also a section dedicated to the intended use, which had to be meticulously detailed. Was this a hairpin for everyday use, or was it reserved for special occasions, such as imperial weddings or mundane Tuesday gatherings? The distinction was vital. Naming. Once submitted, the form would embark on a bureaucratic odyssey, passing through at least 3 different offices before reaching the Imperial Bureau of Hairpin Affairs. Each office would stamp their seal of approval, or disapproval, based on a variety of arbitrary criteria. One clerk might deem a hairpin too ostentatious, while another might consider it refreshingly subtle. This resulted in a system where the fate of a hairpin and its creator could hang in the balance of personal taste. In a rather ironic twist, this meant that the approval process could sometimes take longer than the time it took to craft the hairpin in the first place. Now, picture this. An artisan, let's call her Anna, spends several weeks crafting a stunning gold hairpin adorned with intricate designs, only to have it rejected because the embellishments were one too many. Imagine the despair, the tears, the gnashing of teeth. And so Anna, like many before her, would have to take her rejected hairpin and either modify it based on the bureaucrat's whims or sell it on the black market of unapproved accessories. Yes, there was an entire underground economy thriving in the shadows of the Byzantine Empire, where artisans and fashionable ladies alike engaged in the illicit trade of unapproved hairpins. These underground transactions were a fascinating social phenomenon. Women would gather in dimly lit taverns, their voices hushed as they discussed the latest trends in unregulated hair accessories. Did you hear about the new hairpin by that upstart artisan in Constantinople? One would whisper, eyeing the latest creation that had bypassed the eyes of the Imperial Bureau. It's absolutely scandalous. They would exchange tips on how to avoid the watchful eyes of the local officials, sharing trade secrets about disguising a forbidden hairpin as a mere hair stick, for example. Meanwhile, the Byzantine government, ever the keen observer, would respond to this burgeoning black market with, you guessed it, more rules. New regulations were introduced that required hairpins to be stamped with unique government insignia, which led to even more bureaucracy. A veritable Ouroboros of paperwork, one that devoured its own tail, and the artisans, determined as ever, would forge these stamps in secret, creating a dizzying array of counterfeit insignias that would make a modern-day counterfeiter weep with envy. As the empire flourished, so too did the complexity of the hairpin approval process, leading to a rich tapestry of bureaucratic absurdities. There were dedicated committees formed to assess the aesthetic merits of hairpins, composed of court members who were, let's be honest, mostly concerned with their own hairstyles. They would gather to debate the merits of the curvaceous versus the straight pin, adding yet another layer to the already convoluted process. And of course, these meetings often degenerated into heated arguments, fueled by too much wine and a touch of jealousy over who wore their hairpin best. Ein. With this flourishing bureaucracy, we might wonder, was there any room for artistic expression in the Byzantine hairpin industry? The answer, my dear viewers, is a resounding not really. Artisans were so bogged down by the approval process that many simply opted to produce copies of previously approved designs. Originality, it seemed, was a luxury only the most daring could afford. Those willing to risk the ire of the bureaucratic machine. Go. And so, in a world where hairpins became a metaphor for social standing, the Byzantine Empire found itself enmeshed in an elaborate, often absurd, bureaucracy that transformed an everyday item into a symbol of power, privilege, and pretentiousness. Truly, the history of Byzantine hairpin approval processes is a tangled tale filled with enough bureaucratic red tape to choke even the most resilient of hair accessories. Now, while. So, the next time you lament a boring government form or a tedious approval process in your own life, remember the Byzantine hairpin approval saga. It may just be the most entertainingly dry historical topic you never knew you cared about. After all, in the grand tapestry of history, who would have thought that hairpins could wield such power? But then again, in the world of the sleepless historian, anything is possible, especially when it comes to the utterly mundane. Oh, isn't she? Ha. As the Byzantine Empire sprawled across its vast territories, its citizens were not just concerned with grand conquests or theological debates. They were equally preoccupied with something far more pressing: hairpin. Yes, the humble hairpin became a focal point of imperial bureaucracy. And with it came a flurry of inventory procedures that would make even the most experienced warehouse manager weep with envy. And him sorrow. Every hairpin, from the most modest bronze specimen to the opulent gold-studded variety, had to be accounted for. The Byzantine Empire, known for its love of extensive record-keeping, established a meticulous inventory system that would make even a modern-day accountant's head spin. Each hairpin had to be catalogued by material, design, and intended social class. Bronze, silver, gold. Each metal type came with its own section. And don't even get me started on gemstone embellishments. If you thought the Gemological Institute of America had stringent regulations, you should have seen the Byzantine hairpin inspectors in their prime. Now, one might think that the process of creating a simple hairpin would be straightforward. Not so. The materials had to be sourced from approved vendors, each of whom was required to present their wares at the imperial marketplace. A vendor caught supplying unapproved materials, say a rogue hairpin made from cheap substandard bronze, could find themselves facing a bureaucratic inquisition that would put the Spanish Inquisition to shame. Imagine a group of inspectors with clipboards, meticulously checking each hairpin for authenticity while spouting off about the virtues of proper sourcing. The audacity! Once raw materials were procured, the next step was to assess costs. This was no simple arithmetic exercise. Byzantine officials had a keen interest in ensuring that every hairpin produced was priced according to the specific regulations laid out in the Imperial Hairpin Pricing Codex. This codex was a comprehensive tome that detailed everything from labor costs to overhead, and even the price of incense used during production rituals. Yes, incense. Because what's more important than ensuring your hairpin is blessed by the gods of fashion? The bureaucratic logic was clear. If the hairpin wasn't fragrant, it wasn't worthy. Now, let's talk about the approval process itself. Hairpins were not just approved on a whim. There were rules, regulations, and a veritable labyrinth of paperwork that had to be navigated. First, the hairpin designer had to submit a detailed application. complete with sketches, materials used, and a written justification of why their design was superior to others. Can you imagine the sheer nerve it took to submit a design? Each application was scrutinized by a panel of experts who were, ironically, often more interested in their own hairpin designs than those presented to them. This panel, often made up of aristocrats and their hairpin enthusiast friends, convened every month in a lavish hall decorated with the finest tapestries that depicted, what else? The history of hairpin evolution. The members would gather around a massive table, adorned with hairpin-themed centerpieces, and engage in what historians affectionately refer to as the Great Hairpin Debates. These discussions would often devolve into petty squabbles about aesthetic choices, and who had the right to wear which hairpin, all while sipping on overpriced wines. Once the hairpin passed the panel's rigorous standards, the designer still wasn't out of the woods yet. Oh no. Next came the coveted royal seal of approval, a fancy stamp that cost more to make than some hairpins themselves. The seal was the ultimate validation, and without it, even the most exquisite hairpin was relegated to the realm of the unapproved, and thus, tragically, the irrelevant. Now, let's talk about the logistics of distribution. Once a hairpin was approved, it had to be meticulously catalogued in the Imperial Hairpin Registry, a gargantuan book that recorded the name of the designer, the type of metal used, the date of approval, and a whimsical description that often included phrases like a shimmering expression of Byzantine elegance, or a daring foray into the realm of pointy accessories. The registry was updated daily, and woe betide anyone who dared to forget to enter a new hairpin into the annals of history. Such negligence could result in being sent to the imperial equivalent of the hairpin dungeon, a place where one was forced to wear nothing but the most basic hairpins until they learned their lesson. Speaking of dungeons, let's not forget about the dreaded inspection process for hairpin sales. Each market stall that sold hairpins was required to undergo a monthly inspection. Inspectors, armed with magnifying glasses and a rather inflated sense of importance, would inspect each stall with the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for state secrets. They would check the hairpin's quality, ensuring that they met the strict standards set forth by the Empire. If they found a hairpin that did not meet the criteria, perhaps the gold was a tad too dull, or the design was deemed too avant-garde for the Byzantine palate, the vendor faced severe penalties. These could range from hefty fines to public shaming, which, let's be honest, was the real punishment. Imagine being paraded around the market with a sign reading, "I sold subpar hairpins." The horror! Nah. Panin stu, Dishania, Signondia, wa, down. Now you might be wondering about the costs associated with this entire hairpin approval process. Well, buckle in, because the numbers are mind-boggling. A single hairpin could cost the designer upwards of several talents, an extravagant sum that included production costs, royal approval fees, and bribes to the hairpin inspectors. Yes, bribes existed even in the most sophisticated of empires. This meant that only the wealthiest citizens could afford to don the latest styles, while the average Byzantine citizen was left to make do with whatever was available on the second-hand hairpin market. A veritable wasteland of outdated trends and broken dreams. Let's not forget the seasonal trends. Byzantine hairpin designers were often under immense pressure to remain ahead of the curve. Every season, a new style would emerge, dictated by the whims of the imperial court. The latest trends often included absurdly elaborate designs. Think hairpins that featured miniature chariots or tiny, working fountains. Yes, you heard that right. Some hairpins were not just decorative but also served as conversation starters, or in some cases, drowning hazards. But the most absurd aspect of the Byzantine hairpin approval process wasn't just the endless bureaucracy or the costs involved. It was the social implications. A hairpin was not just an accessory, it was a statement. Wearing an unapproved hairpin was akin to wearing a sign that read, "I'm a peasant, and I don't care who knows it." And so, the pressure to comply with the ever-looming standards of hairpin approval grew, leading to an entire culture obsessed with obtaining the right kind of hairpin. This culture of hairpin elitism inevitably trickled down to the common folk, leading to a plethora of subcultures that revolved around hairpin design. There were underground hairpin black markets where rejected designs could be found for a fraction of the price, often with hilarious results. Imagine the horror of a noblewoman showing up to a court function wearing a hairpin that was clearly an unauthorized knockoff. The whispers would echo through the halls, and the social fallout would be catastrophic. In conclusion, the Byzantine hairpin approval process was a monument to the absurdity of bureaucracy and the lengths to which society will go to enforce standards of beauty and status. The fact that hairpins, small, often overlooked objects, could wield such power is a testament to the intricate tapestry of Byzantine life. So, as you sit back and reflect on the complexities of modern life, remember that hairpins in the Byzantine Empire were not just accessories. They were artifacts of an empire woven together by the delicate threads of approval, power, and, of course, hair. As we delve deeper into the Byzantine hairpin approval process, one can't help but marvel at the dizzying array of mundane details that governed every aspect of this seemingly trivial accessory. Let's take a moment to explore the intricate inventory procedures that defined the life cycle of a hairpin, from conception to court approval. To begin with, every hairpin design had to be meticulously documented. Enter the Imperial Bureau of Hairpin Approvals, an entity that, despite its rather specialized focus, was a veritable behemoth of Byzantine bureaucracy. Designers, often referred to as hairpin artisans, a title that surely held more prestige than it sounds, were required to submit their prototypes to this august institution. Imagine the queues, artisans clutching their creations, anxiously waiting for a bureaucrat to glance at their work as if it were a piece of art in a gallery rather than an object designed to keep hair from falling into one's soup. Wow. The submission process alone was a Herculean task. Each design needed to be accompanied by a detailed inventory form, which mandated that the artisan itemize every component used in the hairpin. Precious metals, decorative stones, and even the type of glue, yes, glue had to be specified, were all scrutinized with the kind of intensity usually reserved for state secrets. A failure to provide a single detail could result in outright rejection. The irony of such stringent requirements for an object primarily designed to keep hair in place was lost on no one, least of all the artisans themselves, who often joked that their work was more a test of their patience than a creative endeavor. The costs associated with materials were another fascinating facet of this bureaucratic nightmare. In the Byzantine Empire, hairpin components were not merely plucked from nature, they were often painstakingly sourced. Artisans would barter and haggle with jewel merchants and metal workers, creating an elaborate network that could rival that of any clandestine organization. Gold was particularly favored, of course, but the Byzantine penchant for extravagance meant that artisans often worked with a variety of materials. Silver, bronze, and even ivory found their way into hairpin designs, the latter being a favorite among the elite. However, let's not gloss over the cost implications. A single hairpin could run the risk of bankrupting an artisan's workshop, especially if the design required rare gemstones. Imagine explaining to your spouse that you've spent the family fortune on a hairpin that was deemed too avant-garde by a bureaucrat with a penchant for traditionalism. The fine line between artistic expression and financial ruin was often a source of heated debates at dinner tables across the empire. Once the hairpin passed the initial round of approval, a feat in itself akin to winning the Byzantine lottery, it was then subjected to a comprehensive inspection process. This involved multiple levels of bureaucratic scrutiny, an entire committee of officials, each armed with a ruler and an unquenchable thirst for precision. They would examine the design for any inconsistencies, measuring the curvature of the pins, the symmetry of the decorative elements, and the overall balance of the piece. A hairpin with a slight imperfection could be rejected on the spot, leading to a cascade of paperwork that would send the artisan spiraling back into the depths of despair. Now. Speaking of paperwork, let's address the bureaucratic rules governing hairpin approvals. There were regulations dictating the maximum length of a hairpin, which varied depending on the season and the emperor's whims. A hairpin that was deemed too long could cause unwarranted attention during a royal event, which was the last thing any noble woman wanted. The Byzantine social calendar was packed with events where the wrong hairpin could send ripples of scandal through the upper echelons of society, leading to whispers, furtive glances, and even the occasional social ostracism. Thus, artisans had to keep a keen eye on both the imperial decrees and the shifting tides of fashion. Moreover, the approval process included an elaborate system of stamps and seals, each more ornate than the last. Once a hairpin was approved, it received a distinctive insignia from the Bureau of Hairpin Approvals, allowing it to be sold in the market. This seal was a status symbol in and of itself. It was not uncommon for noble women to proudly display their approved hairpins as if they were badges of honor, often engaging in competitions to see who could flaunt the most prestigious insignia. The mere sight of an unapproved hairpin could send shivers down the spines of the elite, reminiscent of the societal faux pas of donning last season's fashion. Wow. In a bizarre twist of fate, this approval process also fueled a vibrant network of forgers who specialized in crafting counterfeit stamps. These rogue artisans would create hairpins that were, by all accounts, exquisite but utterly unauthorized. The irony of this underground movement was rich. Artisans who failed to meet the stringent requirements of the Bureau were often drawn into this world of deception, where creativity flourished under the radar of bureaucratic oppression. The black market for hairpins became a hotbed of innovation, resulting in designs that were often far more imaginative than their approved counterparts. However, the risks involved were substantial. A noblewoman caught sporting a counterfeit hairpin could not only face social ridicule, but also provoke the ire of the imperial authorities. As such, the stakes were high, and the underground market operated with the kind of secrecy typically reserved for espionage. It was a veritable game of cat and mouse, with artisans constantly adapting to stay one step ahead of the Bureau's inspectors. Let's not forget the role of aesthetics in all this. The Byzantine Empire was known for its opulence and intricate artistry, a realm where even the smallest accessory could convey deep cultural significance. Hairpins were no exception, with designs often influenced by religious motifs, cultural trends, and even political changes. An artisan might draw inspiration from a recent imperial decree or a significant event, ensuring that their creations remained relevant in the eyes of the elite. All of this culminated in a dizzying array of hairpin styles, each with its own prescribed meaning and social implications. A hairpin adorned with a dove might signify peace, while one decorated with a phoenix would denote rebirth and resilience, themes beloved by the Byzantine population. The meanings were often lost on the unwitting wearer, who might have simply liked the color. Why, intimacy, awandis. The irony, of course, lay in the fact that while hairpins were ostensibly about beauty, they became emblematic of the Byzantine obsession with hierarchy and approval. The sheer absurdity of the situation was not lost on the common folk, who would chuckle at the lengths to which their elite would go in pursuit of hairpin perfection. In the grand tapestry of Byzantine history, the saga of hairpin approval serves as a microcosm of the empire itself, a convoluted blend of artistry, bureaucracy, and social stratification that continues to captivate historians and casual observers alike. So, as you ponder the trivialities of daily life, spare a thought for the Byzantine hairpin, a small yet powerfully emblematic object that encapsulates the complexities of an empire lost to time, but not to absurdity. And the Byzantine Empire, as we've established, had a rather peculiar fixation on the minutiae of hairpin approval processes. The administrative labyrinth surrounding these seemingly innocuous accessories was rivaled only by the Byzantine bureaucracy itself, which was as complex as the most intricate of lace designs. This labyrinthine system was just as essential to the daily lives of the Byzantines as their Byzantine brunches, which consisted of an array of dishes that would take up an entire afternoon, and possibly your sanity, to consume. Let's get into the details, shall we? The first step in the Byzantine hairpin saga was the egregiously tedious inventory process. Hairpin manufacturers, who, in their pursuit of greatness, were often subject to the whims of inspectors with more power than sense, had to maintain exhaustive logs of raw materials and finished products. These logs were not just simple lists. Oh no, they required the meticulous documentation of every individual hairpin created. This included the type of metal used, gold, silver, or the ever-elusive brass, whether it featured any gemstones, and if so, the exact carat weight of each, and even the precise angle of any embellishments. Yes, you heard that right. There were standards for angles. A mere 89-degree angle on a decorative swirl could lead to a rejection notice that would haunt a craftsman's dreams. Once the inventory was complete, it was time for the manufacturers to submit their creations to the local bureaucratic office, a place where dreams went to die and paperwork multiplied like rabbits. Here, artisans faced the first hurdle in a series of bureaucratic obstacles: the application for approval of decorative hairpins, or ADHP, a document that could rival War and Peace in both length and tedium. Completing this application required a comprehensive understanding of Byzantine legal jargon, which was as archaic as the practices it governed. If one dared to make a typo in Section 3B concerning the aesthetic propriety of curved elements, it would result in an immediate return of the application, and possibly a sternly worded letter about the grave implications of such negligence. Now, let's discuss the costs of materials, which were, as one might imagine, as inflated as the egos of the inspectors who approved them. Gold, for example, was not only a symbol of wealth, but also a focal point of Byzantine hairpin design. The gold standard was, quite literally, the gold standard. Artisans had to account for fluctuating market values, which could change from day to day, depending on the latest political intrigue or the whims of the emperor. This created a sort of financial tightrope, where one miscalculation could lead to bankruptcy, or, worse, a lifetime of crafting low-quality hairpins that no one wanted to wear. The cost of gemstones added another layer of complexity. A craftsman might find himself in possession of a beautiful amethyst that could elevate a hairpin from mediocre to magnificent. Beautiful, yes, but also painstakingly expensive. The Byzantine marketplace was rife with traders who specialized in gemstones, often engaging in negotiations that could last longer than an average Byzantine game of chess. One must also consider the ethical implications of sourcing these gems, as many were mined under conditions that would make even the most hardened bureaucrat squirm. For every sparkling gem that adorned a hairpin, there were stories of exploitation and environmental degradation lurking just beneath the surface, a reminder that beauty often comes at a hefty price. Once the application was filled out, the next step was the inspection process, which was both rigorous and absurd. Inspectors, who took themselves far more seriously than one might think, would scrutinize each hairpin, measuring it against a set of guidelines that could make a mathematician weep. These guidelines were not just about aesthetics. They delved into the socio-political implications of hairpin designs. If a hairpin bore a pattern that was deemed too similar to a rival faction's insignia, it could lead to a diplomatic incident. Yes, you heard it right. One hairpin could spark a war. It was a world where hairpins held more significance than many actual political decisions. If the inspectors found a hairpin unacceptable, the artisan would receive a rejection notice that was often more poetic than anything Homer ever wrote. These documents were filled with flowery language, detailing exactly why the hairpin did not meet the necessary standards, a process designed not only to inform, but to humiliate. Athena's efforts, though commendable, have been rendered null by the egregious failure to adhere to the sacred curvature of embellishments. Pray, do not take this as a reflection of thy abilities, but rather an indictment of the chaotic world we inhabit. The rejected artisans were then free to appeal their decisions, a process that involved further paperwork and often resulted in an endless loop of bureaucratic despair. Appeals were rarely successful, but the mere act of submitting an appeal felt like a small rebellion in a world dominated by rules and regulations. Imagine an artisan, clutching their rejected hairpin, marching bravely to the bureaucratic office, ready to fight for the right to create something beautiful in a world that seemed intent on stifling creativity. Now, let's talk about the role of the Byzantine Church in all this delightful chaos. The Church had a vested interest in hairpin designs, as they were often seen as reflections of one's piety. Certain designs were deemed more appropriate for religious ceremonies, while others were considered sinful distractions, akin to wearing a neon sign that read, "Look at me." The Church's influence extended to the approval of hairpins, leading to a schism between fashionable design and religious decorum. Hairpins adorned with crosses were encouraged, while those featuring mythological creatures risked being excommunicated. Of course, this only added to the absurdity of the entire process. Imagine the frustration of a skilled artisan striving to create a beautiful hairpin, only to be told that the delightful dragon design was unacceptable because it did not align with the Church's latest edict on acceptable ornamentation. It was a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in a theological conundrum. And let's not forget the role of fashion trends, which, in the Byzantine era, were as fickle as the tides. One year, the elite might demand hairpins adorned with peacock motifs, while the next, they might opt for simple designs featuring mere pinpricks of color. Artisans, in their quest to stay relevant and profitable, had to stay ahead of these trends, which meant attending lavish gatherings where gossip about hairpin styles flowed more freely than wine. The pressure to keep up was immense, as a failure to do so could result in a swift decline from the heights of society to the depths of obscurity. As Byzantine hairpins continued to evolve and the approval process grew ever more convoluted, the absurdity of it all became a source of dark humor for the common folk. They would gather in taverns, laughing over ales as they recounted tales of rejected hairpins and the bureaucrats who deemed them unworthy. Did you hear about the artisan who was turned away because his hairpin was too avant-garde? What a world we live in. In this tangled tale of hairpin approval processes, we see a reflection of the Byzantine Empire itself, an empire riddled with bureaucracy, power struggles, and a penchant for the absurd. Each hairpin tells a story, not just of beauty, but of the tangled web of social expectations, artistic expression, and the relentless pursuit of approval. As you navigate your daily life, take a moment to appreciate the delicate balance of creativity and compliance that the Byzantine hairpin represents, and remember that behind every small object lies a history as intricate as the hairpin itself. As we dive deeper into the Byzantine hairpin approval processes, Let's unravel the intricate inventory procedures that govern this seemingly trivial artifact. You might think that a hairpin is just that, a simple tool to keep one's hair in place. But oh, how wrong you would be. In the Byzantine world, a hairpin was not merely an accessory. It was a statement, a badge of social status, and most importantly, a subject of endless scrutiny. Fine. To begin with, the Byzantine Empire had an official inventory system, so labyrinthine that even Theseus would get lost in it, minus the helpful ball of string. Each artisan was required to maintain meticulous records of every hairpin they crafted, including the materials used, the weight of the metal, the length of the pin, and even the intended hairstyle for which it was designed. Picture this: a weary artisan hunched over a scroll, painstakingly recording that their latest creation was a 4-inch gold hairpin adorned with a single exquisite opal. In an era where a single opal could feed a family for a month, this was no trivial detail. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Artisans were also expected to submit their inventory to the local guilds, which would then forward it to the Central Bureau of Hairpin Affairs in Constantinople. Yes, that's right. The Bureau of Hairpin Affairs. This illustrious body was responsible for reviewing the inventory from all corners of the empire, ensuring that every hairpin met the stringent aesthetic and functional standards set forth by the Council of Hairpin Aesthetics. This council, composed of disgruntled old men with impressively long beards and even longer lists of grievances, would spend hours deliberating over the minutiae of each submission. Did the hairpin's curvature meet the approved arc of 35 degrees? Was the embellishment in accordance with the latest trends? Or were those decorative motifs deemed SO last season? Now, let's talk about material costs. The Byzantine Empire was a land of luxury, and artisans were often required to use specific materials that were not only expensive, but also regulated to maintain a standard of quality. Gold, silver, and precious gems were the preferred choices, but a hairpin made from these materials was subject to an entirely different level of scrutiny. You see, if an artisan had the audacity to use lesser materials, like brass or, heaven forbid, wood, they would immediately be branded as a pariah, ostracized from the competitive world of hairpin craftsmanship. Can you believe it? A wooden hairpin. The gossip would spread like wildfire through the market stalls. What's next? A hairpin made of dried fish. In the Byzantine Empire, the cost of materials was only one piece of the puzzle. Artisans also had to factor in numerous fees associated with the approval process. These fees could include, but were not limited to, submission fees, inspection fees, and in some cases, a bribery fee. Though they would never call it that out loud. It was more of a contribution to cultural preservation sort of deal. If an artisan wanted their hairpin to be approved quickly, it was often necessary to grease the wheels of bureaucracy with a little extra coin. The more elaborate the design, the more expensive the approval process became. So, you see, the hairpin that took weeks to craft might take just as long to navigate through the Byzantine bureaucracy. And when it finally received approval, it would often cost more than the artisan could afford. Speaking of the approval process, let's delve into the mind-numbingly tedious rules that governed it. The first step, of course, was the initial submission of the hairpin to the local guild for preliminary review. Artisans would be required to fill out a form that could rival a modern tax return in complexity. This form asked for everything from the artisan's name, of course, their age, and the number of hairpins they had submitted in the past year, to a detailed description of their family lineage. Because who doesn't love a good genealogy while assessing hairpin aesthetics? The guild would then assign a hairpin appraiser, a title that sounds more glamorous than it is, to evaluate the submission. Once the appraiser had scrutinized the hairpin under various lighting conditions, because naturally, the beauty of a hairpin is entirely contingent on the ambient light, they would fill out a report detailing their findings. This report would include such riveting observations as, the curvature of the hairpin is satisfactory, or the decorative motif is mildly innovative, but could benefit from a slight twist to enhance visual appeal. After this riveting review, the report would be forwarded to the Bureau of Hairpin Affairs in Constantinople, where it would sit in a stack of other reports until the bureaucrats could be bothered to review it, often weeks or even months later. Oh, why, if the hairpin passed muster, the artisan would receive an official seal of approval. This seal was a piece of parchment adorned with an intricate design that could confuse even the most astute historian. It was not merely a stamp. It was an elaborate work of art in its own right, featuring an eagle, symbolizing the empire's strength, alongside a pair of crossed hairpins, a nod to the importance of this particular accessory. However, if the hairpin was deemed unworthy, the artisan would receive a rejection letter that could rival the most scathing of love letters. The letter would detail precisely why their creation failed to meet the stringent standards, often listing subjective opinions like uninspired design or lacking in historical context. Picture an artisan reading such a letter, their heart sinking as they realize their months of labor have culminated in a fate worse than a bad hair day. The rejection letter would also include a list of recommendations for improvement, almost like a critique from a fashion magazine, but far more serious. Consider incorporating more geometric shapes, it might say, or perhaps a touch of turquoise would enliven the piece. The irony here is palpable. These recommendations came from individuals who likely hadn't created anything more artistic than a lopsided red loaf. To add another layer of irony, the Byzantine hairpin approval process was so wrapped up in its own bureaucracy that it often stifled creativity. Artisans began to find themselves in a loop of mediocrity. The push for approval led to a homogenization of hairpin designs. Instead of innovative hairpins reflecting the diverse styles of the empire, we saw a parade of monotonous submissions that all looked suspiciously similar. It was a tragic irony that the very system designed to promote creativity ended up throttling it, leaving artisans to grumble about the lack of imagination in their guild meetings. Can you imagine if we all designed hairpins that actually represented ourselves? One artisan lamented. We might as well be working in a factory. And yet, amidst all this mundanity, the Byzantine people found ways to inject humor into their daily lives. They would tell jokes about the hairpin process, punctuating their tales with sardonic wit. What do you call an artisan who can't navigate the Bureau of Hairpin Affairs? They'd chuckle. Unemployed. Such jokes, while they may seem trivial, served as a coping mechanism in an empire where the only certainty was the absurdity of life. Unity. So next time you find yourself stuck in a tedious approval process, whether it be for a loan, a job application, or even just a request for a day off, take a moment to consider the Byzantine hairpin. Remember that behind every seemingly mundane object lies a history rich with complexity, a tapestry woven from the threads of bureaucracy, creativity, and, of course, a healthy dose of absurdity. Because in the grand scheme of things, if Byzantine artisans could endure the convoluted maze of hairpin approvals, surely we can bear the inconvenience of our modern-day paperwork. And who knows? Perhaps we, too, will find a way to inject humor into even the most ludicrous of processes. Itchy. As we peel back the layers of this tangled tale, let's delve into the nitty-gritty of the Byzantine hairpin approval process, which, if you can believe it, had more moving parts than a Byzantine chariot, and was perhaps just as likely to end up in a ditch. Picture it. A bustling workshop in Constantinople, where artisans painstakingly crafted hairpins that were, at least in theory, functional. However, the truth is, these weren't just any hairpins. They had to be meticulously designed, often adorned with intricate filigree and gemstones that would make a modern-day jeweler weep with envy. But before these artisans could even think about showcasing their creations, they had to jump through a series of bureaucratic hoops that would make an acrobat dizzy. First, we must discuss the all-important inventory procedures. Every workshop was expected to maintain an exhaustive inventory ledger. Imagine a long scroll filled with the names of every hairpin crafted, along with the size, weight, color, and materials used. These inventory records were not just for show. They were crucial for tracking compliance with the various edicts issued by the Bureau of Hairpin Affairs. Yes, there was an actual bureau dedicated solely to hairpin oversight because, naturally, hairpins were that important. Honey, artisans would often joke that their lives revolved around pins and paperwork, a pun that never got old, mainly because it was the only humor they could grasp in days filled with regulations. The ledger had to be updated with each new creation, and heaven forbid you fail to record something. Missing a single hairpin from the list could lead to a fine worse than a bad hair day, and in the Byzantine world, a fine could mean losing your workshop altogether. So, every artisan was also part-time accountant, meticulously cataloging each pin while trying, often unsuccessfully, to keep their sanity intact. Now, let's talk about material costs. Ah yes, the cost of materials. In a world where gold was as valuable as a Byzantine emperor's whims, artisans often found themselves in a precarious position. The gold filigree used to accentuate hairpins was, of course, subject to market fluctuations, which meant that one day your hairpin could be a luxurious item, and the next day it might cost you an arm and a leg just to buy the gold thread to create it. And don't get me started on gemstones. An artisan could easily spend more on a single sapphire than on a month's worth of bread. To add to this delightful conundrum, artisans had to keep a meticulous record of their materials. Yes, another ledger detailing every ounce of gold, every precious stone, and every scrap of wire. This was not merely for their own benefit, mind you, but to satisfy the Bureau of Hairpin Affairs, who needed to ensure that no one was cutting corners, or, heaven forbid, using inferior materials. You see, in the Byzantine Empire, a hairpin was not just a hairpin. It was a statement. It represented your status, your wealth, and, in some cases, your entire social standing. Imagine the stress involved in complying with all these requirements. One artisan recounted their day. I spent the morning polishing a hairpin that required 3 types of gold and a rare emerald only found in the mines of Asia Minor. By noon, I'd realized I forgot to record the weight of the gold I used. So, I spent the afternoon trying to remember where I placed my scales. And I don't mean the kind you can eat. But, dear viewers, the plot thickens. Once artisans had crafted their masterpieces and painstakingly recorded every detail, it was time to submit their creations for approval. This step alone could turn a simple hairpin into a month-long ordeal. Every hairpin needed to be presented at the Bureau of Hairpin Affairs, which was no small feat, as it could take days just to get through the lines of fellow artisans, all clamoring for their moment in the spotlight. You thought airport security was tedious? Try waiting in line at the Bureau of Hairpin Affairs, where every hairpin was scrutinized under the gaze of inspectors who were, let's just say, less than enthusiastic about their job. These inspectors were notorious for their exacting standards. They had a reputation for rejecting hairpins for the most ridiculous reasons. This hairpin's curvature is not in accordance with the royal decree of 1054. One inspector might declare with a grimace. Another could point out that the design lacked a specific flourish that had been deemed fashionable in the last quarter of the year. Artisans learned quickly to anticipate such critiques and would often bring along a backup hairpin, an unadorned, basic pin that would pass any scrutiny, just in case their masterpiece was rejected. As one artisan lamented, "I've spent more time preparing for the approval process than I have actually making hairpins. If only I could get approved for a job in the bureau instead. And let's not forget the fees." Oh, the fees. Submitting a hairpin for approval came with a hefty price tag. Artisans would have to pay for the privilege of having their creations examined. The cost varied depending on the complexity of the design and the materials used. If you think you're paying through the nose for a latte at your local cafe, just imagine coughing up a pile of coins for a bureaucratic stamp of approval. Oh, all of this was, of course, in addition to the ever-present threat of corruption. Rumors circulated of inspectors with their own preferences, who, for the right bribe, would overlook a hairpin's deficiencies, or even approve a hairpin that was, quite frankly, a catastrophe in design. I once saw a hairpin that didn't even have a point, one disgruntled artisan recounted. It was just a bent piece of metal that resembled a fishhook. But it got approved because the artisan knew the right people. After what felt like an eternity of waiting, paperwork, and potentially bribing an inspector with a bottle of fine wine, because who knew that inspectors had discerning tastes, artisans would finally receive their approval, or rejection. If they were lucky enough to get the coveted stamp of approval, they would then have the privilege of selling their hairpin at local markets, or presenting it to the nobility, where it would likely be worn once, admired for a fleeting moment, and then tossed aside for something shinier. In a cruel twist of fate, if a hairpin was rejected, the artisan had to go back to the drawing board, often incurring further costs to rework their design, only to face the same bureaucratic gauntlet again. This endless cycle of creation and rejection often left artisans feeling like Sisyphus, eternally rolling their hairpin up the hill, only to watch it roll back down each time they failed to meet the stringent standards of the Bureau. Oh, but fear not, dear viewer. Amidst the tedium and absurdity, some artisans found ways to thrive. They formed guilds and alliances, sharing tips on how to navigate the Byzantine labyrinth of hairpin approvals. They'd swap stories over cups of watered-down wine, sharing the latest gossip about inspectors and their whims. In this way, what could have been a deeply isolating experience turned into a community effort. And thus, the Byzantine hairpin approval process became a source of camaraderie and dark humor, a reminder that even in the most mundane of tasks, there was an opportunity for connection, however tenuous that connection might be. After all, in a world where hairpins were the currency of status, the bonds forged over shared frustrations became just as valuable as gold itself. So there you have it. A deep dive into the bureaucratic whirlpool that was the Byzantine hairpin approval process. A story of creativity, frustration, and community woven together with the delicate threads of gold, silver, and, dare I say, absurdity. If only we could apply the same principles of humor and resilience to our modern-day approval processes. But alas, here we are, still struggling with forms and paperwork, perhaps a little less ornate, but just as tedious. But wait, dear viewers. We must delve even deeper into the tangled web of Byzantine bureaucracy, a place where even the most mundane details can spark joy, or at least an eye roll. You see, the Byzantine Empire wasn't just about grand cathedrals, imperial intrigues, or catfights over color palettes. It was also a hotbed of paperwork and procedural minutiae that would make even the most seasoned modern-day bureaucrat shudder. Let us first consider the hairpin inventory procedures. Now, when you think about hairpins, you might envision a quick trip to the market or a simple transaction in a bustling bazaar. But in the Byzantine world, purchasing a hairpin was akin to navigating the labyrinthine halls of a government agency, rife with red tape and more forms than you could shake a stick at. The first step in this intricate dance was the meticulous inventory check. Each vendor, be they a peasant or a noblewoman dabbling in side hustles, had to keep an accurate log of their hairpin stock. Yes, you heard that right. Every single hairpin had to be accounted for, down to the last decorative curl. Eeh. This wasn't some whimsical pastime. No, it was a matter of life and death, or at least a matter of social standing. A vendor who miscounted their hairpins risked not only fines, but also the scorn of their fellow merchants. Imagine the shame of misplacing a golden hairpin worth a small fortune. The inventory ledger had to be updated daily, which meant that vendors often spent their mornings scribbling notes in their dusty books, counting and recounting their precious stock until they could recite the inventory in their sleep. And what about material costs? Ah, the raw materials, the sacred building blocks of hairpin artistry. The Byzantine hairpin was not merely a utilitarian object. It was a canvas for artistic expression, a testament to one's wealth and taste. Gold, silver, enamel, and gemstones were the most coveted materials, each demanding a different level of bureaucracy. Gold was, of course, the most expensive, and acquiring it was a bureaucratic saga worthy of its own epic poem. Before a vendor could even think about crafting a hairpin out of gold, they first had to file a request with the Imperial Treasury, detailing the number of grams required, the intended design, and a compelling reason why they deserved access to the royal stash. I can only imagine how many long-winded justifications were penned. Dear Emperor, I require gold for my hairpin because it will enhance my social standing, and perhaps even catch the eye of a suitable suitor. Yours sincerely, a desperate noblewoman. Once the request was approved, bear in mind this could take weeks, if not months. The vendor would then have to negotiate with the goldsmith. Oh, the tales of woe that could be told. The goldsmith, armed with their own set of bureaucratic requirements, would demand a deposit of silver in exchange for the precious gold, as well as proof of the vendor's eligibility to handle such opulent materials. The vendor might have to present a letter of recommendation from a member of the aristocracy, or a notarized document confirming their status as a reputable merchant. Meanwhile, silver and enamel had their own convoluted approval processes. Silver was more accessible but still required a formal request, often accompanied by a ceremonial bribe, a lovely little token of appreciation for the official processing your paperwork. Enamel, on the other hand, was akin to the delicate spices of the culinary world. It was a fine art unto itself. The production of enamel involved intricate techniques that required the approval of skilled artisans, who were just as bogged down in bureaucracy as the vendors seeking their services. Once the raw materials were obtained, after what felt like a lifetime of waiting, the next bureaucratic hurdle was the actual crafting of the hairpin. Here, we see the introduction of the artisan guilds, which had their own labyrinthine rules about quality control. Each hairpin crafted had to be inspected by a guild member, who would ensure that the craftsmanship met the rigid standards set forth by the guild. This inspection was not merely about aesthetic appeal. It was a litmus test for the artisan's skill and reputation. Whoa, why? Imagine a guild inspector, equipped with a magnifying glass and a stern demeanor, examining hairpins under the harsh light of a flickering oil lamp. They would scrutinize every detail, from the thickness of the metal to the arrangement of the gemstones. If the hairpin didn't meet their seal of approval, it was back to the drawing board, literally. The artisan would have to revise their design, resubmit for approval, and endure the humiliation of having their work rejected. Oh. After passing inspection, the hairpin could finally go to market. But wait! Before a vendor could display their wares, they had to register the product with the local authorities. Yes, even hairpins weren't free from the clutches of bureaucracy. This registration process involved submitting a detailed description of the hairpin, its materials, and its intended price, all written in triplicate. The vendor would then be issued a permit, which they were legally required to display at their stall, lest they be accused of selling black market hairpins. The permit itself was a work of art, a beautifully inscribed document sealed with the mark of the emperor's office. It was not just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of legitimacy, and vendors would often frame these permits, hanging them behind their stalls as a badge of honor. Now, let us not forget the costs associated with all this bureaucratic nonsense. While the materials themselves could run a vendor several solidus, the currency of the time, the hidden costs of time and effort were steep. Vendors often figured in bribes for fast-tracking permits, fees for guild memberships, and expenses for transportation. There's a reason so many Byzantine merchants had a reputation for being miserly. They had to recoup those costs somehow. As hairpins made their way to the market, the entire community was essentially running a social experiment on status: who had the most extravagant hairpin, and who had the most mundane. The market became a veritable catwalk of hairpin fashion, with each vendor showcasing their latest creations, all the while whispering tales of the approval process that they had endured. And amidst all this hairpin drama, can you imagine the conversations? Well, my dear, I hear the guild is cracking down on quality control again. Last week, poor Theodora had to remake her entire batch because the inspector deemed her curl too rustic. Can you imagine? And thus, the Byzantine hairpin approval process was all-consuming and endlessly tedious, a veritable soap opera of epic proportions. It was a reminder that in the grand tapestry of history, even the most mundane objects can take on monumental significance when viewed through the lens of bureaucracy, social standing, and, of course, hair. Morning, indeed. So next time you find yourself tangled in bureaucracy over something as trivial as, say, a parking permit, spare a thought for those Byzantine vendors who fought tooth and nail. Well, metaphorically speaking, over hairpins. Their legacy is the absurdity of the human experience, where even the smallest details can spark endless fascination and frustration. And remember, whether you're navigating the modern world or the Byzantine past, humor is your best hairpin in the tangled mess of life. Oh, ikenmore. The Byzantine hairpin approval process. A veritable labyrinth of rules and regulations that would make even the most seasoned bureaucrat weep into their quill. Imagine, if you will, the bustling stalls of Constantinople, where hairpin vendors peddle their wares amidst the pungent aromas of spices, incense, and occasionally, the faint whiff of desperation. It's a scene reminiscent of a modern-day flea market, except instead of quirky handmade crafts, you have thousands of hairpins, each vying for the imperial stamp of approval. But before we delve into the intricacies of this hair-raising saga, let's discuss the inventory procedures. Oh yes, the inventory. Because what is a hairpin vendor without a meticulously documented inventory? Each artisan was required to maintain an exhaustive ledger detailing every hairpin crafted, material type, color, length, and even the number of curls within each pin's decorative design. Yes, you heard that right. Curls were a legitimate point of contention. A vendor could easily lose their license if their hairpin featured a curl count that didn't align with the approved standards. Now, let's take a moment to visualize the sheer absurdity of this. Picture Theodora, hunched over her scroll, counting curls with the intensity of a tax collector on a deadline, while her competitor, Irene, is busy concocting increasingly elaborate designs to win the inspector's favor. Why? Because the Byzantine Empire, in all its glory, believed that hairpins were not just mere accessories, but rather status symbols, tiny metal emblems of one's social standing, and the fine line between respectability and ridicule. And you thought your last trip to the DMV was tedious. The Byzantine inspection process was akin to a medieval reality show. Survivor, Hairpin Edition. Each vendor would nervously await the arrival of the inspector, who carried with him a list of codes and regulations that could fill a library. How many different materials were acceptable for hairpins? Let's break it down. You had your standard bronze, which was very much in vogue, but not all bronze was created equal. There were different alloys, and each one had to be verified through the strictest of tests, fire, water, and a judicious amount of squinting. Gold and silver were acceptable, but only for the upper echelons of society. Imagine a hairpin made of gold being used by a commoner. The horror! The material costs alone could send a vendor into a spiral of despair. Let's say Theodora had sourced some exquisite bronze from a reputable supplier. Great news, right? Not if the price fluctuated due to some pesky geopolitical issues. A skirmish on the borders could raise the price of bronze to astronomical levels overnight, leaving Theodora with a stockpile of hairpins that no one could afford to buy. Meanwhile, her competitor, Irene, was busy crafting hairpins from the most dubious of materials, recycled bits of scavenged bronze that she'd found near the city's rubbish heap. A true pioneer of the upcycled movement, if you will. But let's not forget about the absolute nightmare that was the bureaucratic red tape surrounding the approval process. Each vendor was required to submit an official application detailing their hairpin designs, complete with sketches and a sample. That's right, a sample. Can you imagine the sheer audacity of crafting a single hairpin to submit for approval, knowing full well that it might get rejected because the inspector had a bad hair day? The stakes were incredibly high. And don't even get me started on the waiting period. Once the application was submitted, with the requisite bribes, gifts, of course, the vendors would enter a purgatory-like state of uncertainty. Days could turn into weeks, and weeks could turn into months. All Theodora could do was stare at her inventory of rejected hairpins, each one a testament to her creative spirit, but also a weighty reminder of her bureaucratic failures. She could only hope that the inspector would appreciate her artistic genius as he or she sifted through the paperwork, because nothing says, "I'm a serious businessperson," quite like a mountain of disapproved hairpins cluttering your store. Oh no. I see it. And who were these inspectors, you may ask? Well, they were a curious mix of aristocrats who had perhaps never crafted a hairpin in their lives, but had somehow been appointed to this most prestigious of positions. Their qualifications: a strong lineage and an uncanny ability to nod sagely while making arbitrary decisions. It was a bit like letting a toddler judge a baking competition based on the color of the cake rather than its flavor. The inspectors, armed with their scrolls, would show up to the stalls, often accompanied by a gaggle of scribes who would frantically take notes. "What do we have here?" One inspector would bellow, eyeing Theodora's latest creation, a hairpin adorned with intricate floral designs that took her weeks to perfect. Yes, the flowers are lovely, but I must insist they are too rustic. A hairpin must embody the imperial ethos of elegance and refinement. Theodora would nod, feigning agreement while internally cursing the inspector's inability to recognize genius. And just like that, her hopes of selling that particular hairpin evaporated like mist on a summer morning. In the background, the scribes would be busily jotting down the inspector's comments, creating a lengthy report that would eventually find its way to the Bureau of Hairpin Quality Control. Yes, that's right. The Byzantine Empire had a dedicated bureau for hairpin regulation. One can only imagine the meetings held in darkened rooms, where officials debated the merits of various curl shapes or the appropriateness of decorative embellishments. Gentlemen, we must discuss the implications of the crescent moon motif versus the traditional flower pattern. What does it say about our empire? While all this was happening, the poor vendors waited, often resorting to elaborate rituals to appease the gods of bureaucracy. Some would sacrifice small tokens of hairpins to the deities of commerce, hoping for a favorable ruling. Others enlisted the help of fortune tellers who would predict the outcome of their applications based on the alignment of the stars. As time crept on, the pressure mounted. Vendors would gather in secret, sharing tips and tricks on how to bribe inspectors without actually getting caught. "I hear a basket of figs can go a long way," one would whisper conspiratorially, while another would nod knowingly, clutching a secret stash of dates that had somehow fallen off a merchant's cart and found their way into the hands of a hairpin vendor. Oh, wonder. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, and probably was, the results would come in. An inspector's approval was akin to winning a lottery ticket, while a rejection was a swift kick to the gut. If Theodora's latest creation was approved, she would celebrate with a feast, usually consisting of whatever leftovers she could scrounge together. If it was rejected, she would mourn the loss like an ancient Greek tragedy, complete with dramatic wailing and perhaps a few choice words aimed at the bureaucratic machine that had crushed her dreams. And so, the cycle of Byzantine hairpin production continued, a never-ending dance of creativity and compliance. Each hairpin was not merely a piece of metal, but a testament to the struggles of its maker, a tangled tale of ambition thwarted by the most mundane of obstacles. Who knew that something as simple as a hairpin could encapsulate the complexities of society, status, and an utterly ridiculous bureaucratic process that would make the most tedious of modern tasks seem like a walk in the park? Messieurs. So, the next time you find yourself getting frustrated over something trivial, remember Theodora, Irene, and the countless other vendors who bled sweat and tears over their hairpins. Because in the end, hairpins and parking permits are more alike than you think. They both serve as the perfect illustration of humanity's never-ending battle against the absurdity of bureaucracy. And just maybe, they remind us to find humor in the tangled mess of life, one curl at a time. As we delve deeper into our exploration of the Byzantine hairpin approval process, it's essential to understand the labyrinthine inventory procedures that would make even the most seasoned warehouse manager weep openly. The Byzantine Empire, with all its complexities, had a surprisingly robust system for managing hairpin stocks, because, as we know, nothing says civilization quite like a well-organized drawer of hair accessories. No. First, let us discuss the materials used in hairpin production. Contrary to popular belief, these were not just any ordinary bits of metal. No, the hairpins were crafted from a range of materials, each with its own elaborate approval process. The procurement of metals like bronze, silver, and the ever-elusive gold was a saga in itself. Vendors had to submit a formal request to the local guild, complete with a detailed proposal that outlined their intended use for the metal, the estimated quantity, and a sketch of the hairpin design. This was not merely a matter of, "I want this shiny thing for my hairpins," but an intricate ballet of bureaucratic red tape that often required multiple signatures from various officials who had little else to do with their lives. The cost of materials was another matter entirely. The fluctuating prices of metals were akin to the rise and fall of empires. One week, silver was the hottest commodity in town, and the next, it was as desirable as a bad haircut. Each vendor had to keep a meticulous ledger, tracking every transaction with the dedication of a monk copying scripture. When prices soared, as they often did, thanks to the whims of the imperial court or a particularly disdainful pigeon that decided to roost atop the local market, vendors faced the existential crisis of whether to absorb the cost or pass it on to their buyer. Customers. Spoiler alert, they often chose the latter, leading to the historic phenomenon of hairpin inflation. Yes, that's right. Hairpins were once known to cost as much as a loaf of bread. And you thought your morning coffee was overpriced. Or, now, let's not overlook the delightful world of inventory management. Vendors were required to maintain extensive records of their hairpin stock, an endeavor that involved keeping scrolls so lengthy they could rival the Iliad in terms of sheer word count. Each pin produced had to be categorized by type, material, and the status of its approval process. A hairpin made of silver with intricate filigree designs would require a different category than a mundane bronze pin shaped like a simple loop. And let's talk about the not approved section, where hairpins languished like forgotten relics, gathering dust and resentment as they awaited decisions from the ever-ambiguous Bureau of Hairpin Aesthetics. Every month, vendors had to submit an inventory report detailing their current stock and new designs. This report was reviewed by a committee of esteemed artisans and bureaucrats, some of whom had never actually seen a hairpin in their lives. One can only imagine the endless debates held in dimly lit rooms over which hairpin design best reflected the imperial aesthetic. Ah, I see you have brought forth a hairpin that resembles a small fish. While innovative, it lacks the gravitas expected of our empire's hair accessories. It's no wonder some vendors resorted to bribery, offering a few extra pins or a particularly splendid ornament in exchange for a stamp of approval. After all, who could resist a free hairpin that might just revolutionize their own updo? And then there were the regulations surrounding the design itself. If you thought creativity was free in the Byzantine Empire, you clearly did not have a hairpin to sell. Each design had to conform to the established styles of the empire, a document that was as convoluted as it was comprehensive. Brocade. Approved. Lace? Absolutely, but only if it was the right shade of gold. Any deviations would lead to swift disapproval, or worse, a public shaming at the market square. Picture the scene. A vendor standing before a crowd, their hopes dashed as they are informed that their new hairpin, which they dared to call the Spiral of Intuition, has been deemed offensive to the Empire's aesthetic sensibility. The shame, the embarrassment, the inability to sell a hairpin that had taken weeks to craft. Once a design was finally approved, the production process could begin. Vendors would gather their materials, often purchasing them from a local supplier who was equally mired in the complexities of Byzantine bureaucracy. The suppliers were adept at the game of inventory management, often playing a precarious balancing act between supply shortages and the demands of their own customers. Hence, it was not unusual for a hairpin vendor to find themselves in a sticky situation, waiting for a shipment of silver that had been delayed due to a bureaucratic mix-up that had nothing to do with hairpins at all, but rather a dispute over the proper crafting of wax seals. The actual crafting of the hairpins was where artistry met monotony, an alchemical combination that could lead to both beauty and madness. Artisans would labor over each pin, painstakingly shaping and polishing them to perfection. This process was often accompanied by the soothing sounds of other artisans cursing their tools, and the occasional shout of, "Why does this always happen to me?" as a hairpin snapped during the final polishing stage. The tension in the workshop could be cut with a knife, but the laughter that erupted when someone accidentally created a hairpin resembling an oddly shaped banana was enough to ease the burden of despair, if only for a moment. Next came the packaging, the final frontier in the Byzantine hairpin saga. Each hairpin had to be presented in a manner befitting its status. A simple twist of wire would not do. No, the hairpin had to be wrapped in silk cloth, tied with a delicate ribbon, and presented in a lacquered box that would make even the most modest of hairpins appear regal. This was more than just a marketing strategy. It was a statement of intent, a promise that these hairpins were not just accessories but luxurious necessities for a proper Byzantine lady. Once the packaging was complete, vendors would set out to the market, armed with their hairpins and a heavy dose of optimism. But The approval process did not end there. Oh no, dear viewers. Upon arrival, vendors had to present their wares to the local market overseer, who would inspect the hairpins with the scrutiny of a judge at a beauty pageant. This one has a slight imperfection, the overseer would declare, holding up a hairpin that, while undeniably exquisite, had a minuscule scratch. Rejections could lead to devastating consequences. The vendor would be forced to return home, head hung low, only to face the wrath of family members who had invested in their ambitious hairpin venture. Hello? And if that wasn't enough, there were seasonal trends to contend with. Hairpin styles were not static. They shifted with the tides of fashion, dictated by the whims of the imperial court or the latest fad among the ladies of the elite. Vendors had to be ever vigilant, tuning into whispers of what would be in next season. If word got out that large, elaborate hairpins were going out of style, vendors would scramble to create smaller, more understated versions, often leading to a chaotic frenzy of late-night crafting sessions, fueled by copious amounts of honeyed wine and desperate hope that their hairpins would find favor in a fickle marketplace. Thus, the Byzantine hairpin industry was not merely a business. It was a complex web of creativity, compliance, and sheer absurdity. Each pin produced was a tribute to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of bureaucratic challenges that seemed designed to thwart even the most determined of artisans. And as we reflect on this tangled tale of approval processes, it's worth pondering. What would our world look like if the simple act of crafting and selling hairpins could bring us together? If only for a moment, in laughter over the shared struggle against the ridiculousness of life? So, as you flip through this modern world of instant gratification and next-day shipping, take a moment to consider the Byzantine vendors, the hairpin artists, and their triumph. Because whether you're wrestling with a hairpin design or a parking permit, there's a little piece of Theodora and Irene in all of us, bravely navigating the absurdities of existence, one bureaucratic obstacle at a time. Now, let's delve deeper into the labyrinthine world of Byzantine hairpin inventory procedures, which, if you think about it, are perhaps the most riveting aspect of our tangled tale. Just imagine a bustling workshop filled with artisans, each one more passionate about hairpin design than the last, navigating through stacks of parchment, quills, and ingots, all while trying to maintain their creative fervor in the face of administrative drudgery. First, we must discuss the inventory system itself, a glorious concoction of scrolls and ledgers that would make even the most ardent bibliophile break into a cold sweat. Each hairpin, no matter how ornate or humble, required meticulous documentation. Craftspersons were obliged to keep records of their raw materials, which, as it turns out, were not quite as simple as you'd think. The favored materials were typically metal, like bronze or silver. But let us not forget the more exotic options. Gold, ivory, and even the occasional gemstone were used when a hairpin needed to convey that status of, I am definitely better than you. But sourcing these materials was an exercise in patience that would test the mettle of even the most seasoned bureaucrat. You see, Byzantine law mandated that all materials had to be registered with the local authorities, who were always keen to tax the artisans on their glittering adornments. Imagine having to march into the local office, hairpin in hand, only to be met with a clerk who looked as though he had just emerged from a week-long hibernation. Yes, I can see you have a lovely gold hairpin here, but can you provide the necessary permits for the gold? And the tax receipts from your last 5 hairpin sales? Needless to say, this process was more convoluted than a Byzantine family tree, requiring the artisans to provide proof of provenance for every single component. A hairpin made from a bit of silver wasn't just a hairpin. It was a bureaucratic nightmare waiting to unfold. Once artisans managed to procure their materials, let's say after several trips to the market, a few bribes, and perhaps some minor emotional breakdowns, they had to address the next hurdle: inventory maintenance. It wasn't enough to just know how many hairpins they had on hand. They needed to categorize them. Yes, categorization was the name of the game. Artisans had to keep track of hairpins with different designs, sizes, and materials. A simple hairpin designed for everyday use had to be meticulously separated from a more extravagant one intended for the upper crust of Byzantine society. This meant that artisans often had to develop a complex filing system that would give modern-day office workers nightmares. But wait, there's more. The Byzantine hairpin artisan also had to track sales and returns, which was a delightful venture in itself. If a customer decided the hairpin didn't quite match their mood for the day, or worse, if it clashed with their toga, there was a return process that involved more paperwork than a modern-day tax audit. Upon receipt of a returned hairpin, the artisan had to fill out a return form, record the reason for the return, and, of course, send a letter of appeal to the local council explaining why the returned hairpin should not count against their monthly inventory quota. Yes, even hairpins had quotas in the Byzantine Empire. Now on to the material costs. Picture this: an artisan stands at their workbench, attempting to calculate the cost of producing a single hairpin for sale. They weren't just figuring the price of materials, they also had to factor in labor, taxes, and the cost of heating their workshop during the chilly Byzantine winters. This was a nuanced mathematical equation that could rival any advanced calculus problem. A hairpin might be composed of a quarter-ounce of silver, which could cost anywhere from a few coins to a small fortune depending on market fluctuations. And let's not forget about the costs associated with compliance. For each hairpin type, artisans would sometimes need to hire scribes to help with the paperwork, leading to an entire cottage industry of scribes specializing in hairpin documentation. Yes, folks, that's right. You could be a scribe whose sole job was to write down that the hairpin made from recycled bronze was registered under the name of Ionas, the slightly less talented hairpin artisan. A title that surely would have looked great on a business card had they existed. As artisans painstakingly crafted their hairpins, they were also required to stay informed about the ever-changing laws regarding hairpin design and material use. One day, they could wake up to discover that a new edict from the emperor mandated that all hairpins must now include a whimsical twist at the end, a design feature that no one asked for but would surely require extensive reworking of their existing inventory. Oh, the horror. This type of whimsical bureaucratic whimsy could send an artisan into an existential crisis, questioning whether they were truly fulfilling their life's purpose or merely a cog in a bureaucratic machine bent on stifling creativity. Yay! Oh, and let's not forget about the hairpin approval processes themselves. Once a hairpin design was created and the materials were procured, it was time to present the creation to the local bureaucratic council for approval. Picture the scene: a group of balding, bespectacled officials sitting in a dimly lit chamber, poring over designs while arguing over the merits of a decorative twist versus a more classical straight form. Approval could take weeks, if not longer, during which time the artisans were left in limbo, wondering if their dreams of becoming the next great hairpin designer would crumble before their very eyes. In the meantime, artisans would often resort to desperate measures to keep their businesses afloat. They'd host clandestine hairpin shows in the back alleys of Constantinople, where they could showcase their latest designs to a select group of customers willing to risk it all for the sake of a fabulous new hairpin. These underground events were rife with excitement, as artisans whispered about the latest bureaucratic gossip, shared tips on how to navigate the approval process, and, perhaps most importantly, sold hairpins that would never see the light of the official registry. As the Byzantine Empire continued to flourish, or, depending on whom you ask, stagnate, This absurd ballet of hairpin production, bureaucratic oversight, and artisan persistence became a testament to the human condition. It revealed a world where creativity was often stifled by red tape, and where the simple act of designing a hairpin became an exercise in frustration and endurance. So, the next time you find yourself in a lengthy queue at the DMV, or wrestling with the complexities of your own mundane bureaucratic matters, take a moment to appreciate the Byzantine artisans and their tireless efforts to produce something as trivial as a hairpin. Because in the grand tapestry of history, it's often the most mundane threads that weave the most remarkable stories. And who knows? Perhaps those Byzantine hairpin makers were just ahead of their time, battling the same bureaucratic demons that continue to haunt us today. Of course, dear viewers, let us delve deeper into the abyss of Byzantine hairpin bureaucracy. If you thought we'd reached the pinnacle of ennui with our previous exposition, oh, how wrong you were. Prepare for a journey so unbearably tedious that even the most seasoned history buffs might find themselves contemplating a nap under their desks, or worse, the very idea of a hairpin. As we dissect the Byzantine hairpin approval processes, we must first confront the harrowing world of inventory procedures. Imagine yourself in the dusty backrooms of Constantinople's artisan workshops, where the smell of wood shavings and metal filings mingled with the pungent odor of exasperation. Each hairpin, whether it be a simple brass clasp or an ornate gold-plated masterpiece, had to undergo a rigorous inventory procedure that would make even the most stoic accountant weep. Every artisan was required to maintain a detailed logbook, a veritable tome of hairpin history, if you will. This logbook was not merely a suggestion, it was the law. Every hairpin crafted was to be meticulously documented, including its dimensions, materials used, and the artisan's personal hopes and dreams regarding the hairpin's acceptance into the annals of Byzantine fashion. Can you imagine the pressure? Will the commissioner of hairpin aesthetics appreciate my artistic vision, or will he deem my work subpar, thus condemning me to an eternity of selling wooden spoons at the local market? Now let's talk material costs, shall we? Hairpins in the Byzantine Empire weren't just random bits of metal. They were status symbols, meticulously crafted from a range of materials. The favored options included gold, silver, and bronze. But artisans had to be acutely aware of the fluctuating prices on these precious materials, which were as stable as a cat on a hot tin roof. A sudden spike in gold prices could mean the difference between a hairpin that sparkled like the sun or one that resembled a rusty nail. Artisans had to keep a mental tally of not only their inventory, but also their finances. They were like a hairpin version of the stock market investors of today, except far less glamorous and devoid of any actual profit. A sudden shortage of copper could send them into a frenzy, leading to desperate measures, like bartering with dubious merchants in the back alleys of Constantinople. I'll trade you 3 hairpins for a handful of copper. No, wait, make it 4. It will be worth it, I promise. But the Byzantine bureaucracy didn't stop at mere inventory and cost. Oh no, my friends. There were layers of regulations designed to protect the integrity of the hairpin trade. Each artisan had to familiarize themselves with an endless scroll of Byzantine edicts. Think of them as the Byzantine version of a user agreement that no one ever reads. These rules dictated everything from the maximum allowable length of a hairpin, because apparently there was a limit on how long your hairpin could be before it was classified as a weapon, to the minimum weight, to ensure that no one accidentally mistook a hairpin for a feather. Now, let's linger a moment on the infamous Hairpin Quality Assurance Committee. This was a group of officials tasked with evaluating the craftsmanship of hairpins submitted for approval. Picture this motley crew, a bunch of middle-aged bureaucrats, perhaps with the excitement of watching paint dry, judging the aesthetic merits of hairpins. They would gather in a darkened chamber, surrounded by an assortment of hairpins laid out like an exhibit at a particularly uninspiring museum. The committee's meetings were legendary for their lack of enthusiasm. Well, this one is shiny, one official might say, desperately trying to muster any semblance of excitement. And this one is not too heavy. The evaluations would often devolve into debates over whether the curvature of a hairpin's design was artistically acceptable, or whether it leaned too heavily toward aesthetic disaster. Each hairpin would receive a stamp of approval, or disapproval, after what felt like an eternity spent in limbo. If approved, the artisan would receive a formal document, which was more than just a piece of paper. It was a coveted license to sell in the Byzantine marketplace. If denied, however, the artisan would have to endure the deeply humiliating process of reworking their design and reapplying for approval. Imagine having to go back to the drawing board for what was essentially a glorified clip for your hair. It was like being told your cake was too dry, and you had to bake it again from scratch. But the frustrations of these artisans didn't end with the approval process itself. No, my friends, they had to navigate the labyrinthine world of distribution and sales as well. Once a hairpin achieved the elusive stamp of approval, it was time to put it on the market. But not before a series of logistical hurdles that would make a modern-day supply chain manager break out in hives. Artisans had to resolve the question of how to get their approved hairpins from the workshop to the bustling markets of Constantinople. This involved coordinating with a veritable army of transporters, each with their own set of rules and fees. I'll need a wagon, and I can only transport hairpins on odd-numbered days when the moon is waxing, one transporter might say, leaving the artisan to wonder just how many hairpins they could feasibly sell before they expired from sheer frustration. In the markets, the hairpins had to be displayed in such a way as to entice potential customers without violating any advertising regulations. Is this hairpin ornate enough? Will the quality assurance officials think it's too gaudy? Should I just stick to a simple design that will surely bore the masses? The stress was palpable, with artisans second-guessing their every move. Let's not forget about the impact of fashion trends on the hairpin market, which could change more rapidly than the whims of an emperor. One week, it might be all the rage to adorn hairpins with intricate enameling, and the next, they would have to be plain and simplistic to stay in vogue. Can you imagine the anguish of having to redesign your entire hairpin inventory to cater to the latest fad of the court? No more gold filigree. Now we need to embrace the humble simplicity of bronze. Who knew simplicity could be so complicated? And as if this labyrinth of bureaucracy and market pressures weren't enough, artisans had to contend with the ever-watchful eye of the public. The social landscape of Constantinople was rife with gossip and scandal, and a poorly designed hairpin could lead to public ridicule. Did you see what she's wearing in her hair? It's simply atrocious. Such remarks could lead to a rapid decline in sales, prompting artisans to reconsider their entire career path. So, as we navigate this tangled tale of Byzantine hairpin approval processes, we find ourselves ensconced in a world where the mundane reigns supreme. The struggle of these artisans serves as a stark reminder of the importance of perseverance in the face of bureaucratic absurdity. Each hairpin, with its own story of trials and tribulations, stands as a symbol of resilience, a tiny, yet powerful testament to the relentless spirit of creativity in a world that often prefers to stifle it. As we wrap up this exhausting exploration, Let's take a moment to appreciate the Byzantine artisans, whose hairpins now serve as artifacts of a bygone era, each one a silent witness to the bureaucratic jungle they had to traverse. Perhaps they realized, as we do now, that sometimes the most interesting stories lie buried beneath layers of tedium, waiting for someone brave enough to unearth them. And just like that, we find ourselves back at the DMV, battling the same demons that haunted the Byzantine artisans all those centuries ago. Welcome to the club. As we delve deeper into the Byzantine hairpin approval processes, let's take a microscopic lens to the labyrinthine inventory procedures that governed these artisans' lives. The Byzantine Empire was nothing, if not meticulous, much like your Aunt Gertrude when she organizes her sock drawer by color, fabric, and emotional significance. The inventory system was a complex beast, where each hairpin needed to be logged with the precision of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. Easy. Imagine the scene, a dimly lit workshop, filled with artisans hunched over their workbenches, surrounded by an impressive array of tools that are about as relevant to hairpin creation as a fish is to a bicycle. Each artisan had to begin the painstaking process of inventorying their raw materials, which included everything from gold and silver to more pedestrian materials like wood and bone. The Byzantine government, ever vigilant, required each artisan to submit a detailed inventory report that documented the quantity, type, and provenance of each material used. This meant that before making a single hairpin, artisans had to spend days, sometimes weeks, cataloging their supplies. They would meticulously pen down each item, ensuring they didn't accidentally leave out that one stray piece of ivory that had been residing in the corner of the workshop for the past 5 years, silently judging the artisan's productivity. Failure to document a single hairpin or its materials could lead to dire consequences: a fine, a public shaming, or worse, being forced to watch hours of tedious governmental meetings about the benefits of standardized hairpin lengths. But let's not get too sidetracked by the inventory. Once the materials were accounted for, the artisans faced the daunting task of calculating costs. Yes, the cost analysis. This was where the fun really began. Artisans had to consider the fluctuating market prices of materials, which were about as stable as a cat on roller skates. Prices could change overnight based on the whims of supply and demand, the trading habits of merchants, or the unfortunate impact of a particularly nasty Byzantine war. Now, imagine sitting at your workbench, surrounded by hairpin prototypes, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship, while you scribble down cost estimates based on the latest gossip from the marketplace. The price of silver has dropped due to the recent invasion of the Huns. I guess I can make 2 more hairpins this week. This constant juggling of numbers and market trends took a considerable toll on the artisan's mental faculties. I mean, who wouldn't be overwhelmed by the financial implications of hairpin production while simultaneously trying to remember whether they had sent in their last tax report on time? Let's talk about bureaucratic rules, the very backbone of the Byzantine Empire's approval process. These rules were so intricate that they could rival the plot twists in a daytime soap opera, filled with unexpected turns, betrayals, and of course, hairpin-related melodrama. Every step of the approval process was governed by regulations that outlined what constituted an acceptable hairpin. Was it the length? The curvature? The number of decorative embellishments? In the Byzantine world, the answer was all of the above, and much more. Artisans were required to submit samples of their hairpins to a committee of esteemed officials, people who, for reasons known only to them, found joy in scrutinizing hair accessories. This committee would then convene in a stuffy chamber, where they would engage in lengthy discussions about the merits of each design. Imagine a group of distinguished gentlemen, clad in robes, peering over a hairpin as if it were the Mona Lisa, debating whether its curvature was too avant-garde or not avant-garde enough. The deliberation process could take weeks. Each artisan awaited the verdict with bated breath, knowing that a single miscalculation could lead to rejection. If a hairpin didn't meet the stringent requirements, back to the drawing board it went. And let's not forget the infamous 3 strikes rule. If an artisan had 3 consecutive rejections, they were required to attend mandatory workshops on hairpin design. Now, imagine the horror of being forced into a room filled with disgruntled artisans while a bureaucrat drones on about the importance of symmetrical embellishments. It's a nightmare scenario, really. Once a hairpin finally received the coveted stamp of approval, artisans could begin production. But hold your horses. They were required to submit yet another inventory report detailing how many approved hairpins they intended to make. This was known as the production proposal. The Byzantine Empire clearly had a flair for alliteration. The proposal had to outline the anticipated number of hairpins, materials to be used, and estimated timeframes for production. Essentially a glorified spreadsheet that would make any modern accountant weep with envy. Why that? And God forbid an artisan deviated from their production proposal. If they dared to make an extra hairpin, they risked the ire of the bureaucratic overlords. Excuse me, why do you have 1 additional hairpin in your inventory? They might ask, their eyes narrowing suspiciously. Did you think you could just produce hairpins without our explicit consent? As if producing something as innocuous as a hairpin was tantamount to treason. The Byzantine Empire had a unique way of elevating the mundane to the level of high drama. It is. But let's not overlook the material costs that persisted throughout this entire process. The artisans had to constantly navigate the financial landscape of materials, from sourcing to pricing. Gold and silver were the crème de la crème of hairpin materials, but their prices fluctuated like a social media influencer's mood. Sometimes artisans would find themselves paying an exorbitant price for a few grams of silver, only to watch it plummet the next week as a new mine was discovered. And, of course, there were the added expenses of transport. This was not your average trip to the local hardware store. Transporting precious materials involved negotiations with merchants, bribes to officials, and the ever-present threat of bandits. One artisan wrote in a letter about the harrowing experience of losing a shipment of valuable hairpin materials to a gang of marauding thieves. I had just paid a small fortune for those beads, only to have them snatched away by ruffians, they lamented. Now I must find a way to explain this to the Committee of Hairpin Approval. All of this culminated in an exasperating environment where creativity was often stifled by red tape, and artisans were forced to become part-time accountants, bureaucrats, and negotiators, all for the sake of a hairpin. The sheer absurdity of it all leads one to wonder how such a trivial accessory could necessitate such an intricate web of regulations. Yet, amidst the endless forms, meetings, and material costs, one must admire the sheer tenacity of these Byzantine artisans. They battled against a bureaucratic system that seemed determined to sap the joy from their creative endeavors. Each hairpin they crafted was not merely an accessory, but a defiance against the labyrinthine protocols that sought to suffocate their artistry. And as we navigate through the tedium of Byzantine hairpin approval processes, we can't help but draw parallels to our own lives. Aren't we all just crafting our own hairpins in a world filled with endless regulations, costs, and committees? The next time you find yourself filling out a form or waiting in line for approval, take a moment to remember the Byzantine artisans, the hairpins a symbol of resilience in the face of a bureaucratic maze. And with that thought, Let us celebrate the absurdity of this tangled tale, one hairpin at a time. Oh, as we delve further into the Byzantine hairpin approval processes, let's take a closer look at the inventory procedures that govern the very existence of these ornamental objects. You see, in the Byzantine Empire, every single hairpin, from the most opulent gold leaf-adorned creation to the simplest wooden stick, was subject to the scrutiny of a bewildering array of regulations. The artisans, those brave souls willing to tackle the monumental task of creating something that could hold a few strands of hair together, had to maintain meticulous records of every item in their inventory. Well, it is said, imagine, if you will, a humble hairpin maker named Alesios. Every morning, before the crack of dawn and the arrival of his much-needed coffee, Alexios would sit down at his rickety desk, quill in hand, preparing to record the hairpins he had crafted the previous day. Each entry required not only the type of hairpin, was it a decorative one with intricate filigree work or a utilitarian pin designed solely to keep rebellious curls in check, but also the materials used, the time taken for crafting, and of course, any embellishments that might have been added. In this case, an embellishment could be anything from a tiny gemstone to a particularly audacious feather, and Alexios had to ensure he accounted for every last detail. But wait, it doesn't end there. Once Alexios completed his inventory log, he had to submit a copy to the local guild, who would then review it with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for an audit of the imperial treasury. This wasn't merely a casual glance at the numbers. No. This was serious business. The guild members would engage in lengthy debates over the accuracy of Alexios's records, and if they found a single discrepancy, perhaps an extra hairpin listed or a missing material, Alexios could find himself facing penalties that would make a modern-day tax audit seem like a day at the beach. Now, one might argue that this level of oversight is unnecessary. But the Byzantine Empire thrived on the belief that oversight was essential to maintain quality and prevent fraudulent practices. A rogue artisan could, heaven forbid, create subpar hairpins that might collapse under the weight of even the lightest hair, thus threatening the very fabric of Byzantine society. After all, who could take a ruler seriously if their hair was in disarray? Speaking of materials, let's take a moment to appreciate the cost associated with these hairpin creations. Crafting a hairpin was not merely a matter of picking up some twigs and calling it a day. Oh no, dear viewer. We're talking about a financial investment that could rival the costs of maintaining a small household. The artisans had to source metals like gold, silver, and bronze, each with its own set of price fluctuations that could make or break a hairpin's worth. Imagine the palpitations that Alexios would feel each time he had to visit the local market to haggle with the blacksmith over the price of bronze. 5 coins for a handful of bronze rods. You've got to be kidding me, he might exclaim as he tries to negotiate what feels like a life-or-death situation over a couple of ounces of metal. And if he were particularly unlucky, he might find himself in a bidding war with another artisan, each trying to outwit the other, while the market crowd gazes in disbelief at what has become an impromptu episode of The Price is Right, Byzantine edition. Once Alexios managed to acquire the necessary materials, he then had to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucratic rules before he could even think about selling his hairpins. Each hairpin had to be presented to the local authorities for approval, a process that frequently required a waiting period that made the Odyssey of Odysseus look like a weekend getaway. The artisans would gather in the local marketplace, clutching their carefully crafted hairpins like prized possessions, waiting for the officials who would ultimately determine their fate. Oh, the joy of waiting. It was not uncommon for artisans to sit around for hours, discussing the latest gossip while secretly hoping that the official in charge would have a good day and approve their creations without the need for further modifications. The process was unpredictable at best. One moment a hairpin could be deemed an exquisite example of craftsmanship. The next it could be rejected for being too avant-garde, or not in keeping with the traditional motifs of the time. The sheer volatility of the approval process could lead to hairpin artisans developing an intense fear of creative expression. And let us not forget about the official approval forms, which were as convoluted as a Byzantine hairpin itself. These documents were often written in Latin, a language that many artisans struggled to read, and filled with legal jargon that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics for all the sense it made. In accordance with the Code of Aesthetics and Utility, Section 17, Paragraph 3, Subsection B, it would read, "The hairpin's adornment must not exceed 1/3 of the total length." One can only imagine the artisans scratching their heads, trying to decipher how exactly to measure an adornment without the aid of a caliper or an overly enthusiastic neighbor with a penchant for mathematics. In this bureaucratic ballet, the artisans became adept at navigating the red tape, learning the tricks of the trade to expedite their approval processes. Some resorted to bribery, a practice that had been around since the dawn of civilization, while others formed secret alliances with officials to ensure their hairpins would sail through the approval process. One might even say that the true craft of hairpin making was not just in the design, but in the negotiation skills necessary to get the darn things approved. Once the hairpins were finally approved, praise be to the heavens, the artisans could then sell their creations at the market. But this was not the end of the road. Oh no, it was merely the beginning of another cycle of bureaucracy. Once sold, each hairpin had to be registered with the local guild, cataloged for inventory, and accounted for in the artisan's financial records. This was critical, as failure to report a sale could lead to accusations of tax evasion, which in Byzantine times was akin to being branded a criminal. Now, the cycle continued endlessly, with artisans left to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they should have taken up a trade that didn't involve so much paperwork. Perhaps pottery. But then again, pottery had its own set of regulations, including kiln temperature approvals and glaze certifications, each more tedious than the last. So, dear viewers, as we immerse ourselves in the mind-numbing minutiae of Byzantine hairpin approval processes, let us take a moment to appreciate the artistry and resilience of those who dared to craft in a world mired in bureaucratic red tape. Wow. Diet. Mirrors. Yeah. They navigated through a maze of inventory logs, material costs, and approval forms, only to emerge victorious, albeit exhausted, with a mere hairpin in hand. Each pin was not just a practical tool for securing hair, but a battle standard in a war waged against the whims of the bureaucratic establishment. And perhaps, as we soldier on through our own mundane tasks, be it filling out endless forms or waiting for approval in our daily lives, we can find a sliver of solace in the knowledge that even the simplest of objects, like a hairpin, has a history fraught with challenges, absurdities, and a good dose of irony. After all, who knew that the humble hairpin could tell such a grand tale of struggle against the forces of tedium? So, the next time you catch a glimpse of your reflection in the mirror and see your hair held aloft by a simple pin, remember, it's not just a hairpin. It's a symbol of an era, a testament to the trials of countless artisans, and a reminder that sometimes the most tedious of histories can be found tangled within the most unexpected of places. As we wrap up this thrilling journey through the Byzantine hairpin approval processes, yes, you heard that right. Let's reflect on how a simple accessory became the epicenter of imperial bureaucracy. Who knew that the fate of fashion could hinge on a committee of wig-wearing dignitaries poring over designs in candlelit chambers, debating the merits of each pin like it's a life or death matter? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. We've learned that sometimes style isn't just about looking good. It's about navigating an absurd labyrinth of regulations that would make even the most seasoned paper pusher weep. Incheri. So, if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Byzantine bureaucratic hairdos, or if you just want to feel better about your own struggles with paperwork, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe for more riveting tales of historical tedium, and drop a comment below about your favorite hairpin or bureaucratic blunder. And don't forget to turn on loop, because let's be honest, you'll want to relive this glorious snooze fest again and again.